This video is one of a set of videos on the topic of note-taking. And in this particular video, we want to talk about the online outlining method. This uses indented outlining, and this is often used when we're taking notes. The information which is most general begins at the left, nearest the left margin. And as we move across, as we indent it, the information is less important. It's still a category of the one above it, but it's less important. So more specific groups of facts indented with space to the right. So the more specific facts are moving across, like A, for example, here. The most important is number 2. The information which is most general begins on the left. But as we want to consider information which is less important, it's indented. We move across. Ensure that there's enough space to enable expansion into subheadings. That's important. If you're going to use this method, make sure you've got enough space on the paper to allow the indenting to happen. Finally, numbers and letters and Roman numerals, they're not needed. Simply indents will suffice. Often when people are using this on a word processor, they give it nice letters and so on. That's okay, that's acceptable, but it's not strictly needed. The indent itself tells you just by looking at it that the point is not as important as the one above it. Point A on this slide, more specific groups of facts, etc., that point is not as important as point 2. The information which is most general begins at the left. That number 2 is more important than A, but B is of the same importance as A. And 3 is more important than A and B. Now the method. Well, place the most important points close to the left. The most important points go to the left margin, towards the left margin. And indent more specific points to the right. Levels of importance will be indicated by the distance away from the major point. So the more a point is to the right, the less important it is. The most important one is the one towards the left. So in the example we've got here, 1 and 2, those are two very important points. They're on the left. Now the advantages of this method, well, it's very well organized if it's done right. If it's not done right, obviously it's not very good. But it's it's clear. It's a very simple system, and it's very clear if it's done correctly. It records the contents as well as the relationships. It tells you what that part is about, but it also tells you how important it is. And the importance is measured by how far from the left-hand margin it is. It reduces editing and is easy to review by turning main points into questions. That's a technique that we'll come across much later, but it is useful. The disadvantages, well, it requires more thought in class for accurate organization. You have to be clear about how you're going to do it, and it can get a little confusing, particularly if the lecturer is skipping forwards and backwards, and you think a set of points are finished, but in fact the lecturer goes back and adds another one later. Now you've no space. You've run out of space because you didn't think it was going to happen. So it can be a little confusing. When to use it? Well, outlining formats can be used if the lecture is presented in outline organization. That's the best way. If the lecture or the notes you're using are already in outline organization, that's the easiest to use, obviously, because the structure is already planned out for you. We say it may be deductive or inductive. Now, deductive is when you have a point to the left, near the left margin. That's the major point. And then underneath, you have a point that's indented, that's moved across slightly, so it's not as near to the left margin as the first one. That means it's not as important. So that's deduced. It's deductive, we call it. If it was the other way around, if the major points were to the right, then you would say it's inductive. But don't get too worried about those expressions. They're very rarely used, in fact. Just that is formally the way it's called. Use the format when there's enough time in the lecture to think about and make organization decisions when they are needed. Make sure that you've got enough time to be able to organize your notes and you've got enough space on the paper. Otherwise it can become very confusing. So make sure there's enough time in the lecture to think about what you're doing. So make sure you've got the major points and all the sub-points that are indented across one or two spaces or whatever it is. It can be most effective when your note-taking skills are super sharp, when you can handle the outlining regardless of the note-taking situation. If you're really good at this, it's a really wonderful way of taking notes because it indicates importance as well as content. So that's really useful. So for an example, here's one on inflation. Now forget what economists would say about this particular set of notes on inflation because it's highly contentious amongst the economic community. But just for our purposes here, we're just looking at the style. So one, definition, that's important. So it's a one, it's close to the left. Two, number two, that's two kinds. That's important. There are two kinds of inflation in this particular example. As I said, economists would disagree with this, but I'm just using it to illustrate, so it's okay. So there are two kinds. And what are the two kinds? Well, one is demand pull and the other is cost push. They're indented. Because the most important thing here is that there are two kinds of inflation according to this particular view. The next point is, well, what are they? So that's less important. Then we've got the causes of inflation. That's important, so that's in number 3. That's nearest to the left. Then the consequences of inflation, and that's nearest to the left, so that's important. And then underneath, the consequences of inflation, well, unemployment and the balance of payments, and there are other points as well, which we won't go into, but they're not as important. So they're indented to the right. So now you can see the important points and you can see the less important points, and they're all organized in the outlining method. So it is a very useful approach. That's all we're going to say about it. So thank you for watching.